Cleveland's Asiatown has always been known as a hidden gem in Northeast Ohio. However, things are changing. Since 2009, the Cleveland Asian Festival has been a driving force in bringing thousands of people into Asiatown. The festival provides a dazzling array of entertainment, education, and so much tasty food highlighting Asian culture. As it has grown, so has the neighborhood. Asiatown now welcomes thousands of visitors throughout the year. Whether it's for groceries, restaurants, or just taking in the atmosphere, Asiatown has become the preeminent destination in Northeast Ohio to learn about and enjoy Asian culture. Growth in the area continues. Many businesses have steadily opened, bringing economic impact and job opportunities to the area. New residential investments have helped grow the population. Asiatown is evolving thanks to so many committed, passionate community stakeholders who are working to make their neighborhood better while enriching the lives of their neighbors. It's easy to see why Asiatown is such a diverse, energetic neighborhood that represents the best of Cleveland. Exactly when the first Chinese immigrants arrived in Cleveland remains shrouded in mystery, though most believe it was sometime in the 1850s. However, with no official record, there simply is no empirical data to confirm this. Also, most books written about Cleveland contain only passing references or completely ignore those first settlers. The information we have today, the vast majority of it at least, has been passed down through the generations. The early Chinese traversed a long, winding path, survived hostile environments, turmoil, even upheaval. Most of them came either from the West Coast or from urban centers like New York. Their tale is one of enterprise, sorrow, gritty determination, persecution, and thankless labor. The first Chinese to come to the United States were lured by the discovery of gold in California in 1848.
People in China were trying to avoid some of the chaos that was going on in their country during the time, and they wanted to take a chance. They were hearing about the California gold rush, and they wanted to see if they could make their fortunes here, just like so many people. A lot of people went over to California to try to make this happen. We had 3 Chinese people noted on the 1830 census, and every year more and more people would try to come over. The gold rush afforded the chance of a lifetime for people to make their fortunes and make their families' lives more improved, and hopefully eventually send their money back home or go back home.
By 1852, 20,000 had arrived in the state. Some white prospectors quickly became envious of the hard-working Chinese laborers. A spate of attacks against the Chinese, both physically and statutory, started. Many Chinese became enslaved. The winter of 1852 saw a rash of beatings, murders, robberies, and hangings of Chinese. That same year, state legislatures enacted restrictive laws to debar Chinese by slapping a tax of $3 per person on foreign miners and requiring ship captains to pay $5 to $10 per passenger. The U.S. Congress followed in 1882 with its own version of these laws. Despite the draconian policies, the Chinese managed to draw grudging praise for their hard work. In January of 1852, California Governor John McDougall openly praised the Chinese as, quote, one of the most worthy of our newly adopted citizens, and called for more Chinese immigrants. Sadly, however, just 4 months later, those restrictive laws were passed. The persecution of the Chinese had only begun. On May 6, 1882, President Chester Arthur signed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which debarred the entry of skilled and unskilled Chinese for 10 years. 2 years later, more restrictions were added.
And that precluded the immigration of most Chinese to the United States. So the percentage of their population, where it was large on the West Coast, would diminish over time. And in cities like Cleveland, there was not a large flow of people, although Chinese kept coming to fill positions here, or to come here and to start a business.
The persecution of the Chinese, especially on the West Coast, their usual port of entry, drove them north and east. Nearly all came seeking relief from the intense anti-Chinese hostility, trying to find new economic opportunities. The 1900 U.S. Census showed roughly 89,000 Chinese in the United States. down from 104,000 just 10 years prior. It wasn't just general hostility towards these immigrants that undermined their existence. Laws were created to do the same thing. In 1904, the U.S. government enacted a total ban on Chinese immigration that remained in place in some form until 1943.
New families and new residents came to the city. As far as 1910, I think the census here said that 11 Chinese people lived in the public square area, and 8 of them said on the census they originally were in California before they came to Cleveland. Though the repeal of the Exclusionary Act in Cleveland and abroad allowed more people to come to the city, unfortunately it was a very slow rollout. At first there's only like 100 people could come a year over. For decades there was exclusionary practices, and that didn't allow families to grow in Cleveland. But when it was repealed, it gave a chance slowly to build up and better your family and bring more people to the area.
The Chinese was fighting with the Americans at that time. We were good people at that time. In fact, we had a parade in Cleveland. They had a Chinese flag. People on the street would throw money in there, It was in the 40s.
The 1965 Act changed much, not just for Cleveland, but for the country. Finally, people were allowed to come here and bring their families. Early exclusionary practices, you couldn't allow your wife to come over. You would have to wait 10 years to come to America. So finally with this act, it righted so many wrongs in the past and decades of abuse of not allowing residents come and set up shop.
Many of the Chinese immigrants who came to Ohio settled in Cleveland, specifically along Ontario between Lakeside and St. Clair. Most had some education and work experience and opened small service businesses like laundromats, restaurants, grocery stores, even clothing boutiques.
I don't remember riding a tricycle, but the first time I saw that I saw a picture of me there riding a tricycle. There's no Chinese children around. Cleveland News is on the 18th on Rockwell, and Chinatown's on 21st. So they come to Chinatown to go to a restaurant, like Shanghai restaurant there. They see a Chinese kids, they talk to them, and they took our pictures. In fact, there's one picture, first time I saw it was in the newspaper. I was eating an ice cream cone.
One of the entrepreneurs was a Mr. Wong Ki, who opened the first Chinese restaurant at 1253 Ontario Street back in 1859.
And this was sort of groundbreaking for the community, not just for the Chinese community, but for Cleveland's expansion and understanding of what immigrants could bring to the community. This first venture on Ontario was great, and it led to the Golden Dragon on Public Square being built, and word spread of the amazing food, and really it was a great social gathering for the Chinese community. And this is important because there weren't a lot of places that were welcoming in of immigrants. So you needed a place, a base of operations, a place to decide, talk politics, recreation. So his early venture by this gentleman paved the way for so many others to have opportunities. So it always starts with one person, and as we see in the history of Cleveland, many more Chinese restaurants were opened up in different sections of the city, but it all started with him.
Sun Yat-sen was the father of China. He was from Guangdong province. He came to Cleveland one time.
Chinese settlers in Cleveland became such a significant force that Dr. Sun Yat-sen, the father of the Chinese Revolution, came to Cleveland in 1911 during his worldwide tour, lobbying support for the overthrow of the Qing dynasty. Dr. Sun spoke at the Old Stone Church, one of the first Chinese churches in Cleveland.
The nationalist rise at the end of the dynasty in China occurs at the same time that America is trying to export democracy. And we see that during World War I when Woodrow Wilson goes to the Versailles Peace Conference, and he advocates for what I would call self-determination of what subordinate states in Europe. And he continually talks about democracy. It's an exportable product. And so Sun Yat-sen and the nationalist movement and the new movement in China is China's modernizing. And that was very, very powerful in the United States. And I think that began to grow more favor for the Chinese in the United States because it looked more like our system.
Two nuns, Sisters Marianne M. and Mary F. Trapp, worked for 3 decades with the Chinese. They taught themselves a working knowledge of Cantonese and helped the Chinese with business problems and other matters.
Well, Old Stone Church plays a central role in the history of Chinese Americans in Cleveland, and it really goes back to the time when the first Chinese were coming here in the 1870s and 1880s. They would have settled around this area because it was a business area. It's where they had laundries and small shops. The church reached out to them because Old Stone Church was supporting missionary activity around the world. So they were working with people that they wanted to be kind to and also wanted eventually to convert. And so this became, in a sense, a real sanctuary for the early Chinese in Cleveland.
And they did this by sometimes intervening and speaking English on behalf of the Chinese community to other residents in Cleveland. They learned the language so that Old Stone Church would be the one place where everyone was welcomed.
I noticed there was a Chinese church going on in the Old Stone Church. So I came to worship, and then eventually they bought the church on Trubisky Road and formed the Cleveland Chinese Christian Church.
In December of 1941, a Chinese Christian church was established along Euclid Avenue. It took over masses, Chinese lessons, and youth activities from the Old Stone Church. These lasted until 1953, when Reverend Dr. William Fung left. In 1965, Stanley and Kay Ang obtained use of the Old Stone Church for use by Protestants who had previously been meeting for prayer service in homes. The Cleveland Chinese Christian Fellowship was formed, and on June 12, 1966, masses and other services began at the Old Stone Church.
Stanley Ng was one of the presidents during the 80s. He was the one recruiting me to be a member of the Cleveland Chinese Benevolent Association.
He saw the needs of the senior citizens. Without knowing English, they really needed support. They really needed opportunities to socialize. And so he, along with others, developed the Asian Evergreen apartments that stand to this day and provide a place of community.
Asia Evergreen apartment building is one of the senior apartment building built in Cleveland. The purpose is for the senior Asian can live together, can speak the language, and easier for them to communicate, and also with the walking distance for them to go to the store or grocery or do anything around town. We also have the lunch program for them inside the building so they can come down to have a nutrition lunch and keep them healthy. And beside that, we all have other activity for them to do inside the building, like Tai Chi, Chinese stroke right, the Chinese word, and also the fence dancing and other activity.
Stanley Ng also recognized the need for medical services in the community, and he was instrumental in bringing about the Asia Plaza Health Center. That work has now grown and expanded through Asian Services in Action that has now developed the International Community Health Center that provides that same type of service in the community.
And as he passed away, they dedicated a street after him on 30th Street.
Stanley Ng wasn't alone. There were many other trailblazers in the community as well that really helped to establish organizations to support the community, including Fran and David Namkoon, Alex Mark.
David Namkoon and Fred Namkoon is a very, very hardworking and helping out the Asian community. And then I know them through the board, and they also the board of the Cleveland Chinese Benevolent and also in the Evergreen building. They are always to get a lot of program helping for the agency that we can work out to provide the service for all the Asian community in Cleveland. They have been working all the way until I think they're 80 before they really retire. We owe them a lot of gratitude.
The current newspaper, every Chinese journal, was started by Po Ying. One woman kind of handles the newspaper with some help. We benefit from the newspaper quite a bit because we now know news from this area and also China.
With the increase of businesses and population, the Chinese organized a form of business control. Traders set up two merchant associations, or tongs, the An Liang and the Hip Sing. The tongs, usually formed along family names, were intended to protect and safeguard the interests of the group. The two associations were competitive. At times, their rivalry took violent turns.
I think the American image of the tongs has always been skewed toward violence and gangs and whatever else, and I think that is in part slightly true, but the tongs were basically merchants' associations or groups. They came over from China. The first tong in Cleveland was the Anliang tong. And then in 1911, a second tong was started, the Hip Sing tong, and they began to get into a conflict over recruitment of members, or what I would call their turf or territory. There were some acts of violence between them. There was a fairly serious incident in 1924 when somebody was shot 5 times. And at that point, the safety director of Cleveland in 1925 decided that he was going to end the tong wars. And his decision to end the tong wars involved arresting every Chinese male in Cleveland, about 700 of them. And then he closed down the businesses and the shops along Ontario. He proposed the raising of those shops and businesses at that point. And this basically got down to Washington, D.C., to the Chinese diplomatic mission, because not only were they arresting Chinese who were residents of Cleveland, but they were arresting male Chinese students who were here. And this hit the national headlines, and eventually it was quickly rescinded, and the city apologized to the Chinese, but this is this image of what was going on.
I want to tell you that my father was in jail. It was around 1920 something. Because the Tong War, they put all the Chinese in jail, every Chinese in jail.
And we know that by, I believe, the 1930s, the Hip Sing and Anliang Tong are working together. They started a fund to return the bodies of dead Chinese, 170, to China for burial.
In 1943, the infamous Chinese Exclusion Act was finally repealed, paving the way for the immigration of students and professionals. They came to all the major centers of higher learning in the United States, including Cleveland. Most of these people planned to acquire knowledge, then return home. But the Communist Revolution of 1949 left many stranded here.
They started a little newsletter called the Chinese Students Newsletter, and they were beginning to push the United States government to begin to protest against Japan because of Manchuria, and then the entire invasion and the massacres that occurred at that point. So they were taking a stand, and they were publishing a newspaper in Cleveland. So obviously, if you have Chinese students here, they're studying at a university, and it had to be Western Reserve or Case or maybe Fenn College. Fenn College would be a good place because that was sponsored by the Young Men's Christian Association at that time.
Chinatown only consisted of Rockwell Avenue. There was, of course, the Shanghai restaurant, the Three Sisters, the Golden Coins. There was the Min Sang grocery store. My mother came down to Chinatown once a week, and she spent a lot of time in the Chinese grocery stores.
Cleveland Chinese Benevolent Association and Onliang is on top of the building owned by Onliang Association at that time. Cleveland Chinese Benevolent Association is the first Asian established organization set up in Cleveland during the 1990s. The purpose is to help for the newcomer or the immigrant come to Cleveland and settle down in Cleveland and try to help them get the job and settle for them to the family to go to school. That agency have been established all the way until today, still functioning. Matter of fact, I'm one of the president of the Cleveland Chinese Benevolent Association today.
同埋中華咧，亦每一年咧都有一個聚餐，同埋咧我哋有好多嘅活動，例如獎學金每年嘅慶祝活動係凝聚所有我哋嘅中國人一起。大家但係咧頭獎我哋有300蚊，二獎第一名我哋300蚊，第二名200蚊，第三名係100蚊。錢唔係好多，但係我哋都希望鼓勵我哋後生一輩勤力啲去讀書，少少嘅心意嘅啫。
The early immigrants had a vision of community and things as important as just having a place for the community to be buried was vitally important. So they bought large plots of land at the West Park Cemetery so that Chinese people could be buried together as a community. Many of the families also developed associations. They're not just local, but these family associations are nationwide or in some cases global, having roots going back to China or Hong Kong. So for example, my father was part of the Wong Family Association. The Wong Family Association actually purchased property in Cleveland so that as Wongs, as the family, could get together and celebrate on occasions such as Lunar New Year and other important events.
They told me there was like 90 laundries in the northern part of Cleveland. And the laundry are usually all men. There's no ladies, because the ladies were not allowed to come to the United States unless you were a merchant.
I was walking alone on the street, and there was a car that pulled up to me, rolled out the window, just cranked this way, so you know it's a whole car. And the guy yelled out, I don't know if I'm going to say this or not, but okay, just say it. Hey, Ching boy, give me some egg roll. So at the time, I didn't know that was a bad term. So I went home and asked my cousin, is that a good term or bad term? And my cousin said, no, that's a bad term. You don't want people calling you that name. So that's probably my first experience. I was probably like a junior in high school when that happened.
Back when I was young, as a kid, of course, we didn't really recognize it as racism. We just viewed it as perhaps bullying or mean kids. But reflecting back on it now as an adult, it absolutely was racism. One memory I have is changing of names. In Chinese culture, a name isn't just like Mary, Joe, Sam. The names have meaning. They are words that are used to identify the person. Those beautiful, meaningful names, unfortunately, due to racism, with people that aren't familiar with the culture, end up as terms of mocking. When I came to America, my Chinese name phonetically was translated into Wing Wong. And you can imagine growing up some of the ridicule that I had because of my name, where kids would mock it and make rhymes out of it. I hated that. And when I became a US citizen in my teen years, I made the choice myself. I didn't want that name again. And I elected to have a similar sounding name, and I decided to select Wayne as my name because it's Americanized. And I think that's sad, because those beautiful, meaningful names were given to them from, in my case, my grandfather, often because of the love that they have for the children. If we tolerate racism, that leads to escalation. That leads to the things that we see on the news every day. Just this year, 2021, we have this huge upscale in Asian hate. So much so that throughout the country, including here in Cleveland, Ohio, we had to have the Stop Asian Hate rallies, the marches, to just draw attention to this escalation of violence that's been tolerated. Well, we shouldn't tolerate it. It's wrong. And I think the importance of the community coming together, being proud of our heritage, and making a stand is very, very key, very, very important. And I'm proud of this Cleveland Asiatown community for standing up and making our presence known.
My aunt and uncle actually experienced quite a bit of racial disparity. There were signs that were on the water fountains then that said, no blacks, no chinks can drink from this fountain. So they were really abused. When I was growing up in the city of Cleveland, we were two families that went to Claremore School, and children walking by and singing Ching Ching Chinaman, that type of thing. And I remember being quite offended by that and very upset by that. But being raised by my mom and dad, we were always told, be sure you didn't do anything bad. Be sure you were always the best, because you are one of two families here. They'll always be able to point you out. You're the one that did it. It was the Chinese girl or it was the Chinese boy. It was the younger Chinese boy because that was my cousin, and he said, you don't want to bring that shame back to the community. So know that you are a representative of the community for all Chinese. It was interesting also when I went to different larger organization meetings that they will always say, you know, we consider you white. And my comment was always, why do you think that was better? You know, because they thought they were giving me a compliment. And it was important for me to understand being considered white was not a compliment. And I know people are like, oh, because they never thought of it otherwise. They didn't realize that they were denigrating me in that respect. And I'm thinking, you know, you need to rethink. And I think because you're part of Cleveland, there's such plurality here.
I think one of the very interesting things of being, you know, African American and then having an Asian wife has been this sense of people, as they do with me, I get the little kind of microaggressions, but then seeing them to my wife as well. For instance, me and my wife were at a restaurant just recently, and after I left to go to the bathroom, the woman came up to my wife and said, oh, your husband must be in the military. From the standpoint that the only way that we could have met was from the fact that I met her as a soldier in Japan or somewhere else. And so she hears that more than people would imagine, and it's frustrating to her because she's someone who got her master's degree in college and whatever, and she's very talented. And the only thing that people can think of her as the only reason she would be connected to me would be because she wanted to be a military wife. And the thing about it is that my children also see that, and they feel this, and I think they've really, as they've gotten older, have been able to work through the two worlds, right? At first, you know, not black enough to be with the black kids, not Asian enough to be with the Asian kids. And while they spent time with both groups, they did make friends, and they did find a way to transition to be able to be in the Chinese school and have friends in the Chinese school, and then be here in Cleveland at a predominantly black school and have black friends. And so they see it now as a gift that they've been given to understand these two different cultures. When people would see my kids, because my wife was Chinese, they would be like, oh, your kids are going to be fine. They're going to end up being lawyers and whatever. And there's this stereotype that people have about the Asian community because it's so simple. People in many ways just want to simplify their life, and the simplest you can make it in to say, oh, the black guy is an athlete in the military, Asian person is someone who's going to be a doctor or whatever, or you know, other stereotypes that they have that are worse about them. And that's as far as they want to go. And I think a big part of what you're doing, and I think a big part of what we have to do, is continue to open up the doors so that we can get people to understand who we are.
Yeah, for my children, it's interesting times. I call them my pandas. They're black, white, and Asian. I just had a conversation with my daughter, who's 8 now, about race. She overheard a professional development I was on via Zoom. So we were at home and I was on a Zoom, and it was diversity training for staff at Gala. And it was really great, interesting conversation. And we were talking about racial identity and how it's important to consider like how people identify, and that there could be many ways that someone identifies. And I remember my daughter coming over to me and asking me, Mommy, what does that mean? And so I explained it to her. I said, well, there are many different races. People identify with their race depending on who they are. And then I explained to her, I said, Mommy is half white and half Asian. And so those are my identities. And so if someone were to ask me, I would say I'm both. And I was like, and Simone, you're different because you're Asian, white, and black. Mommy's not black. And so then I asked her, I was like, how do you identify? And she said, black. And I was like, that's great. Inside, I will admit, I was a little bit sad. Not because there's anything wrong with how she identified, but I felt like I was a little bit erased. I wasn't in her identity, which is fine. And the other thing I know is your racial identity as a biracial, multiracial person will evolve as you get older. But the other complicated thing about it is when people see her, I don't know how they will identify her because she doesn't necessarily look just Black. It's complicated, so you're constantly struggling with how you feel, how others identify you, and then you become aware of expectations.
The 1965 Immigration Act raised the annual ceiling on Chinese immigrants from 105,000 to 200,000. This got rid of a big barrier and allowed a new influx of people to come to the United States. At the same time, the differences between the Cantonese and Mandarin dialects became more pronounced, and those people really started to keep their distance. As we venture into the past, we've met with many Chinese Americans and have found out more about their lives here in Cleveland.
Because my sister was in Cleveland here, and then we cannot see each other because we are from Thailand, and then so we just our family said, why don't we just move down here because they need to go to the college too.
Donna, I'm always asking the dad for help. Wang Feng, Charles Lee, Anthony Ma. I always look up to my dad. Say, oh, when you say something, people will listen to you. And I guess that my dad has some kind of that kind of effect. So people always encourage him to lead. People encourage to do things. People always ask him for advice. My dad has always had entrepreneurial spirits. He didn't have the means to do that when he just came to the United States. So he worked himself and then finally saved enough money. So the first business that he started is mail order business. So he sell specialty teas, herbal teas, and ginseng tea over the mail. So he put ads in newspaper, in Chinese newspaper, American newspaper, like Plain Dealers. And then the second business that he had was the Yellow Pages. So that was his first venture into the newspaper and the business. He go to Chinatown and he know a lot of friends, but people don't know information about what's happening in the community, the contact information. So he lists all the information, like grocery, restaurants. One of his advisor said, hey, you have a way to print Chinese characters and you know English and Chinese well enough. Why don't you produce a newspaper? And for a while, my dad said, no, it's too much work. And he doesn't know whether it's gonna be accepted and if it's gonna make money. But he realized that there's a need in the community to have a newspaper. My dad's newspaper is marketing news. My dad's shop is America Marketing. Don said, why don't you open a gift shop here? So my dad thought about it and says, it's probably good for Asia Plaza, so it might be good for him too. Actually, he's the second business owner that opens up in Asia Plaza. So Hall 1, who's owned by John Louis, opened up first. And then my dad opened a second store. It's a small store. Then Li Wang opened up there weren't so many places in Ohio that sells like Chinese dress, Kung Fu shoes. Because my dad said we have somebody that drove up from Columbus looking for Kung Fu shoes. And also nunchucks. So my dad said, we probably are the only place that have nunchucks and Kung Fu shoes in the whole state of Ohio. And during Chinese New Year, he sells greeting cards and also the red envelope.
My name is Margaret Wong, and I'm born in 1950. I came from Hong Kong in 1969, August. And I came to America to go to college with a little sister. I'm lucky because since I moved to Cleveland in 1978, my family started the Pearl of the Orient restaurant. I worked for a law firm. Of course, I was fired because I was not too good. And I have an accent, and being a Chinese, being in the 70s, it's not chic to hire Asians. Most law firms thought a Chinese national really won't do well for these major law firms. And I didn't know that at that time. I never thought I would build a business and a legacy from it. Yeah, but it's just something that I need a job.
We lived on the west side of Cleveland, and when I was little at that time, the Cleveland Metropolitan School District was busing to integrate. That was not the best experience for myself and my sister. The student population was not ESL. English as a second language. Because at home I was blending languages, I needed support, I needed intervention. I spent 2.5 years at that school, and I learned nothing. From what I remember, I don't remember learning anything because I still didn't know how to read or write. And later I found out that I was identified as special ed because the school thought I had a learning disability. Something happened, I don't know. I was 6 or 7 at the time, but my family moved at just 5 minutes west into Lakewood. So right away, Lakewood identified me as a student that needed help with English. And then within 6 months, I remember learning how to read and I was so excited. I was reading everything, cereal box, labels on signs. The memories never leave you. The feelings never leave you. And so when you lose your language and you assimilate, you also lose a piece of you. And when you lose a piece of you, it's hard to get it back. I started a school called Global Ambassadors Language Academy, GALA for short. The reason why I started the school is very much tied to my experience growing up in Cleveland. GALA is an immersion school. Immersion means that our children learn through the language. Every single day, for the majority of the day, the children are learning their subjects in Chinese or in Spanish. So the goal of the school is for students to become bilingual in Chinese or in Spanish. But some of our students actually are native speakers of those languages, but parents are still interested in bringing their children to GALA because it's a place that celebrates their language and culture. So if a family is speaking Chinese or Spanish at home, the children comprehend everything, but they don't necessarily communicate back, and then the reading and writing is lost. So it's a really great celebration of diversity in language at GALA.
My grandfather, Jack Jung Lee, who stayed in the U.S., was able to raise my Uncle Edward Lee, and my Aunt Betty Lee, here. My mom and my Aunt Mary went back to China during the war. Once my grandmother came, they were able to save enough money. They opened 3 Chinese Sisters restaurant. But they always felt it was important that we give back to the community. So they were very involved with a lot of the events that happened in Cleveland. Was because of their location being in Chinatown, oftentimes we had a number of politicians dining with them. A lot of the media dining there, since the plain dealer was right by. So by the time they had my Uncle Andy, he actually had quite a civic spirit with him. So my Uncle Andy and Dennis Kucinich were classmates, and they both felt it was important to give back to the community. And so Andy would walk around in the Chinese community, try to get people to sign their ballots. And he was so funny because he speaks Toisan. A lot of the Chinese that were living in Cleveland at the time spoke Cantonese. So because of the difference in the dialects, he was saying things like, "We'd like for you to vote for my friend," and it sounded like he wanted that person to kill him. So it was hilarious, and he realized his pronunciation wasn't perfect. So he'd come back to my mom and dad and say, how should I say this, and how do I say that? Because my dad spoke Cantonese, my mom spoke Toisan along with him. Because there was 3 Chinese restaurants for Chinese New Year's, there was the Shanghai mentioned, my parents' restaurant, and my grandparents' restaurant. My father was known to have the best cooking of all of them. So whenever we would have our Chinese New Year celebration, a number of the delegates from all over the country would come to Cleveland. You had the right to go to any one of the 3 restaurants. Our restaurant, which was a 100-seater, was the first one to fill up every single time.
係安兩個會長，我亦係中華會館嘅主席，同埋咧我哋公司咧有一間叫做合豐超市嘅我屋企咧本身就喺廣東中國廣東深圳嘅。咁我爸爸咧，我一出咗世，我爸爸出咗去香港啦。咁我同我媽媽咧，我6歲我就出香港，咁跟住到我18歲咧，我12歲我媽媽過咗身，我18歲咧，我爸爸就申請落嚟。我爸爸就喺1966 66年、67年已經嚟咗美國啦。我開始合風嘅時候咧，係幾個朋友，因為我哋都係嚟到克利夫蘭嚟到 Cleveland， 我哋係做餐館，因為當時嗰個超市所有嘅超市，佢哋個因為佢哋嘅門路嘅問題啊，嗰個 connection 嘅問題啦，係嗰個價錢啊，我哋睇到個價錢又好高，同埋唔得新鮮。我本身喺由香港嚟美國嘅時候，我就係喺紐約。喺紐約嘅時候，我見到紐約嗰啲華人嘅超市咧，係比較係新鮮啲，個價錢就好啲，所以我哋就幾個朋友就商量，就試下就開一個送貨公司，我哋自己去紐約買啲新鮮嘅嘢去提供俾嗰啲餐館啦。價錢又比較公道嘅嘢。
My first memories of Cleveland was working with my dad. He would take us when we were very young to Cleveland's Chinatown. He's over on Rockwell Avenue. That's where he worked, and that's where we spent most of our time when we were growing up. My dad worked for a small store there. They supplied restaurants all over the greater Cleveland area. As we grew, probably since the time I was 8 or 9 years old, he would take us to work with him. So we would help him with his deliveries and anything around the store that needed done. And at the end of the evenings, sometimes they'd teach us some kung fu. That was kind of a bonus. My dad, he lived in Cleveland right after the war. He fought in World War II for the United States. Trained in kung fu over in China when he was really small. He immigrated here when he was 12, and then he learned more once he immigrated to the United States. As a young man, he learned quite a bit. Combat style of martial arts. He was tested. I remember I was probably maybe 12 or 13 when they tried to rob him on Cedar Avenue, and that's where the kung fu paid off, where he disarmed a gunman that actually fired a round at him out of a .38 revolver. He was able to take the gun away from him. Didn't know that the gun was real. Turned it over to the police. Found out within the next week or so that the van that he was in was having some electrical problems, and the mechanics actually dug a .38 slug out of the dashboard. So he made it into a necklace for my mom. Kind of an inappropriate gift, I think, but something to remind us of what the importance of life and of being able to protect yourself. Started learning lion dancing again when I was about 14 and wanted us to get more involved in that. More, I think, for conditioning. We've been conditioned since we were probably in our early teens, just working in the store. When everybody else was carrying small things, we were the guys that had to carry 100-pound rice bags. I think I remember my 16th birthday, I got two 100-pound rice bags for a gift. We were unloading the truck at a restaurant called Young Singapore, and I put one of these big 100-pounders on my shoulder, and I started going towards the store. My dad told me to come back. I said, "What for?" He goes, "You're going to take 2 of them." So I still remember it's 7 steps up to that deck from the street to get those 200 pounds up the stairs. So we did quite a bit of strength training. Lion dancing, just another version of that. And then learning the subtleties and the history and the traditions behind it. Well, in the 35 years that we've performed the lion dance, we've gone to, we started out going to the restaurants that my dad, he was friends with, just as a sign of respect for them for helping support us. We've trained for all different types of events. The best ones are the smaller ones at the restaurants where the crowds really come out to see us.
When we evacuated from the Saigon, the old capital of Vietnam, we arrived in the refugee camp. And then later on, then go through the local service agency called Nationality Service Center. They found a sponsor for us. So we are arrived in Cleveland in June 6, 1975. And then we stayed with the sponsor for a few months until I find my job. Then we have enough, then we're moving out on our own. And I've been established the easy business to start with the Asian restaurant, which was the first one opened, a Vietnamese restaurant in Cleveland in 1978. And after that, then after my accident, I established 6 more restaurants around town. Yeah, and then also I continue to do my import-export and also my air freight company. In 1997, And my friend introduced me to the building owner here. They have interest to sell the building. And there was one time I'm thinking about that I'm so fortunate, established my life in Cleveland, then it's time for me to do something to repay the community. And that time in the west side of Cleveland here, this area is a very rundown area. And then this is a big project. A lot of people don't even care to pick it up. And I just take my chance. I believe with my hard work, with my energy, I can make it successfully. My priority is for the local, for the charity community.
My father was sponsored by his uncle. They moved to Cleveland because they have some relatives over here. They don't come to here just to come to Cleveland, but he wasn't allowed to bring his wife at that time. So that's why my mother did not come for them. The family had a truck that goes out every day, and they stop at all the Chinese laundries and also the Chinese restaurants. And then he would walk in the truck or laundry and say, hey, I got this today. I got bok choy, I got tofu. Then he would go out on the truck and bring it in. Just before around Second World War, he went on his own. I actually was born in Cleveland, and the address, I remember what it is 2166 Rockwell Avenue. I have 2 brothers and 2 sisters. I have a sister that was in China that I didn't know about. When my mother came here, she left my sister in China, 9 years old, to come to, because she wasn't allowed to come here. My brother-in-law brought my sister over here.
Well, my grandfather owns part of the grocery store, Chinese grocery store, Sanwa Yiki. And when he passed away, my dad came to Cleveland to run his part of the grocery store. And that's how we came to Cleveland. And me and my friends and my brother and sister, we used to play around the old Chinatown. We would play softball, go to the elementary school, which is down the road. And in the summertime, they had like a vacation school for kids. And downstairs, you could hear a lot of people playing poker and all kinds of Chinese games. In the daytime, it's kind of peace and quiet. People come to the restaurant to eat. We make bean sprouts downstairs in the Chinese grocery store. I used to ride with George Kwong. He used to go deliver Chinese groceries to different Chinese restaurants.
My grandmother moved to Cleveland in 1966. Her name was Mei Chung. My grandfather was Yu Pak Chung. They were born in China. They ran a grocery store in Hong Kong, along with the Chung family. They remained in Hong Kong throughout the Communist Revolution. And then finally in 1960, when my mother married my father and settled in Youngstown, they had the opportunity to come to the United States after they secured their permitting. They chose East 33rd Street because, again, they saw what a nice big house they could buy for very little money versus what they could get in Hong Kong. My father worked as a county engineer for Cuyahoga County as a bridge designer, and my mother worked as a server in a Chinese restaurant, Sai Wu, in Parmatown, and China House in North Olmsted. Our family did not start Asia Plaza. It was actually started by John Louis, who ran Hall 1, and his brother-in-law, Tak Wai Ko. It was located on East 33rd Street in St. Clair. He thought that Cleveland could support an Asian mini mall, and he moved Hall 1 to this location at 2999 Payne Avenue. Unfortunately, John Louis didn't have any real estate development experience. He literally caused his company to go bankrupt trying to develop a little Asian mini mall. And as his company was going bankrupt, he approached my parents to see if they were willing to pick up this project. My parents agreed, and we started off with Liwa and Asia Plaza. Asia Plaza started off as an old factory, and they added on the old former Cleveland Food Bank in 2016. Our vision is to see more Asian development between East 30th and East 40th. And again, it would lean towards Asian development, new housing, new commercial businesses.
My grandfather was in the United States first, and he started a restaurant called Chonghua Restaurant back in the 1940s. It's one of the oldest restaurants in the Cleveland area that I'm aware of. He eventually brought my father and my family to America. My grandfather's restaurant, it was interesting and unique in that its operating hours were 4 p.m. to 4 a.m. So they actually served a very unique clientele in the Asiatown, back then it was called Chinatown neighborhood, because the Cleveland Agora and factories and all the news stations would have their night shifts come off of work, and they're all hungry and they're looking for places to eat, and they all came to Chonghua. So one of my favorite memories as a child is in the restaurant, my grandfather had this wall. We call it like the Wall of Fame of all the local celebrities, and in some cases national celebrities, that would perform in Cleveland and then go to the restaurant to eat because it's one of the few places that was open.
如果講正 Chinatown 咧，初嚟嘅時候係好熱鬧，雖然佢鋪唔多，但係因為當時個華人通常都係跳船嚟啊，冇家庭嘅，大家一齊聚埋一齊啊，傾偈啊，打下麻雀啊，甚至乎有啲人需要嗰啲老闆需要請人啊，佢就落唐人街啊，問你哋有冇人做工？有啲人冇做工，佢就落唐人街咧，就睇下有冇人請人，喺一個地方係一個好好嘅聚集。但係而家嘅 Chinatown 咧就好大，就多咗好多街多咗好多。
In my view, what really kind of accelerated the growth of Chinatown that eventually became Asiatown was the development of Asia Plaza by Donna Ham and her family. And then later, this center that we're in, Asian Town Center, by the Duong family. These two plazas and shopping plazas really helped to cement the community and provide anchors. When we first came to Cleveland, there were just a few Chinese restaurants, a very close-knit family. All the families in the neighborhood knew each other. It's interesting that now in Asiatown, we no longer call it Chinatown because it's much more inclusive. It's grown so much that we don't just have Chinese restaurants. We now have many different Asian restaurants. So we call it Asiatown now.
I've been fortunate to go throughout the United States and see Cleveland Asiatowns or Chinatowns across the country. Some have far less potential and are far less connected than Cleveland's Asiatown, and some are far more connected than Cleveland's Asiatown. I think having talked to a number of people who are around Cleveland Asiatown, who work in Cleveland Asiatown, who have businesses in Cleveland Asiatown, they want Cleveland's Asiatown to be more connected. And while it's better than many cities, I think there's so much potential for it to be so much more.
The fact that we have an Ethnic Eats and it's in their 8th volume right now, and it points out all these different restaurants that we have, the types of restaurants that are available, is something we should celebrate. The fact that the Chinese Lantern Festival is bigger every year.
I can only look forward to how the community is going to progress in the decades to come, so that 10 years from now, 20 years from now, as Asiatown continues to grow, what can this community be? How will it grow? But my hope is, with that growth, we as people never forget our roots.
The big celebrations, the dinners, different associations would host dinners, different families would host big dinners. It would all culminate on Chinese New Year's Eve on Rockwell. We were the noisemakers. We were the cymbal and gong beaters. And my sister would she was the cue person. She'd give us the cues coming from the inside of the Onlyong Temple. She would watch for my dad's signal, and she'd relay the signal to us when it was time to start banging on drums and beating on gongs and cymbals. And then she'd give us the cutoff. The second signal was the firecrackers.
It was important because every piece of anything we consumed that day meant something. If you had we had to have longevity noodles. We had to have that so that we all have long life. And there's actually a dish that they serve where it's one continuous noodle, and your chef is really great if they didn't have to break up that noodle when they stir-fried it. We'd have to have fish in our meal. We had to have vegetables, so we'd always have prosperity and good fortune coming to us. And I think it's important for family members to continue to celebrate Chinese New Year's. We always had our our New Year celebration within our family, and then after that family dinner, we would invite as much guests as we could.
Lunar New Year means a lot to me. and my family. My wife is Chinese, and and being able to understand what it means to her, and in a variety of times we've gone back to China during Lunar New Year, and you see what it means to the Chinese, and it is much different, even with that it's celebrated here in the United States, even when it's celebrated in such a great way that we do here in the city of Cleveland. You really see the magnitude of it.
I remember the first year I arrived in Cleveland, and we went down to the Rockwell Avenue at midnight. Then they have the lion dancing, firecracker, and then also after that, then they have their food for you to welcome you to come over, and then they will give out the red packet. It's the good luck money for all the people that come to join.
The Cleveland Asian Festival, I think, is a great example of how persons with great ideas can change the world.
The Cleveland Asian Festival started in 2010. While the neighborhood was already growing very well, I think it really took the vision of some of the community leaders, including Lisa Wong, Johnny Wu, and Vi Huyen, who were the founders of the Cleveland Asian Festival, to really cement that growth. The festival's purpose is to celebrate our culture, our diversity, but also to bring attention to this community, Asiatown, that has so much to offer to Greater Cleveland. We have typically over 100 different vendors and exhibitors at the festival, and many of those vendors take the opportunity at the festival to really get their feet wet. They love it, and they end up starting their own business in the local community.
A lot of people didn't even know Asiatown existed. When they go to the Cleveland Asian Festival, they're like, where am I? Oh, there's an Asiatown, that's great. So they come to the festival, they have a great time. The community has a chance to share their services or products. That may have been their first time in Asiatown, but that's not going to be their last time.
It has brought the Asian community together. It has brought thousands of Asians, in fact, many Asians from out of town just to come and see the event. Even this past year, when the event wasn't hosted, there were many Asians coming here looking for the Asian Festival, even though it was a virtual event.
The vibrant Asiatown you know today really is just the start, to serve as inspiration for future generations of AAPI to continue the legacy and build an even better neighborhood. So the next time you're in Cleveland, swing by Asiatown. Check out the stores, eat at the restaurants, and experience Asian culture as a whole. This has been the oral history of the Chinese who immigrated to Cleveland and made it their home. I'm Chris Tanaka. Thanks for joining us on this journey.